All right, great. Well, welcome to our school board webinar. I'd like to thank the Child Protection League for hosting this for us tonight. My name is DeEtta Moos, and I'll be facilitating part of this. And I've never done anything like this before, but like a lot of you, we're all stepping into roles that we've never done before for such a time as this, right? Well, let me briefly introduce myself. My husband, Todd, and I are business owners, are small business owners. We have 4 kids, and I've been homeschooling the whole time. So you may ask, what am I doing here, right? Well, it changed after the death of George Floyd. And as I watched for 3 nights, the rioting and the looting and the disrespectful and abusive behavior of our police, all done by young people, it made me question what is happening with our youth. And it made me question there must be something wrong with either our families or our schools. And so I decided to start attending school board meetings to find out what's going on. There's something going on that I need to find that out. And so during COVID, I started attending school board meetings as a homeschool mom because I wanted to know. And as I attended, no one else was attending with me. So we're in the middle of COVID. Our children are being masked. They're being social distanced. They're on again, off again, hybrid. And no parents are at the school board meetings. I was shocked. So as I sat and learned and watched, then I started to have questions. And so I questioned our superintendent, and I questioned our curriculum director, and I questioned some of our school board members just to gain understanding of how the school works and how this all happens. And then I started talking to other parents and grandparents and getting them involved. And so we started a small group that now attends the school board meetings and talks with our school and helps encourage them to do the right thing. And so now as we move into the next season, we're hoping to help you get informed so that we can run good qualified school board members, because I think a lot of school board members either don't know what's happening or are actively working against what we stand for. And so as a school board member, we really need you to be well informed in what we are trying to put forth. And so I wanted to welcome all of you for attending. And I want to introduce to you the speakers that we have in front of us. So first of all, I'll introduce Alex Newman. He's an international educator, journalist, author, speaker. He's involved in several areas, but a couple of resources that have been especially helpful to myself is he co-authored a book called Crimes of the Educator: How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. He's also senior editor and contributor to an online magazine called The New American, which contains several articles on education. So welcome, Alex. And I have also Diane Douglas. She has been actively involved in Arizona's education landscape for over 25 years. As a leader of the Arizona Department of Education, former Superintendent Douglas was devoted to improving education in Arizona. She believes the only way to accomplish this is to return education to its original purpose, the acquisition of knowledge through a classical education. She has now turned her efforts to sounding the alarm about the government-controlled, politically correct indoctrination of public schools and helping parents find true educational alternatives for their children. And to that end, Douglas now serves on the Educational Advisory Board of Public School Exit. So welcome, Diane. And also with us, we have Tanya Simons. She is currently serving on the school board here in Osseo, Minnesota, which is the 5th largest school district in Minnesota. And she's going to be very helpful with answering any local Minnesota questions that pertain to us here in Minnesota. So welcome, Tanya. And finally, we have Kelly Jansen and Julie Quist. They are joining us from the Child Protection League. The Child Protection League is a Minnesota nonprofit that fights to protect children from exploitation, indoctrination, and violence primarily dealing with educational policy, and they also work to pass legislation through their 501c4 Child Protection League Action to help children. Julie Quist is the chairwoman, and Kelly Jansen is the project manager and board member. So welcome, Kelly and Julie. So here we go. As attendees, you are all able to type in your questions so that we can pull them off the screen and answer them real time. So Julie, you want to explain how that happens? I mean, not Julie, Kelly. Can you hear me, Kelly?
I know.
Oh, there you go.
Just trying to get it unmuted. Thank you, DeEtta, that was awesome. So yeah, you can just type your questions into the Q&A, and we have a few questions that we're going to be going over first, and then we'll get to your questions. So you can think a little bit, and then we'll get to your questions, but just keep putting them in the Q&A box there, and we'll love to hear from you. Thanks so much, everybody.
All right. Well, we did get a few questions ahead of time, so we'll just pick up those questions first. So Diane, starting with you, first thing we want to talk about is the school board position in general. So what effect can a school board member have on the education of our children, and how can they realistically hope, what can they realistically hope to accomplish? So if they're running for school board, realistically, how can they affect what's happening today?
Well, and I ask your forgiveness. My dog gets a little barky, so I'm trying to keep her quiet. We have kind of a standing joke, if you will, down here in Arizona. We say, thinking of a 5-member school board, you don't have to be really smart to be on a school board. You just have to be able to count to 3. So, you know, it depends on the laws of your state and the authority that's been given to a governing board. If you hold the majority of the board, you can accomplish so much. You know, here in Arizona, state standards are set at the state level, but governing boards choose the textbooks, they choose the curriculum, they choose the instructional method. So if your board is unhappy with CRT or SEL or CSE, whatever it is, you can remove that from your district. Here in Arizona, we don't have a requirement for sex education, so there's no reason districts have to do it, but most do because they have a majority of the board that thinks it should be in place. So in many ways, you can accomplish a lot theoretically. I mean, I've gotten to a point where I don't believe, because of how ingrained some of these things are into the system, that they really get removed. What we're finding too is there are things that parents and even some superintendents don't think is happening, but yet public records requests are showing that absolutely it is. So I think when we get into the areas of our teacher training and so many things, it's so deeply embedded. You know, theoretically, yes, you can change it, but realistically, I'm not so sure how much it changes.
Right. Well, and Alex too, I kind of wanted the same question for you. You know, just as a school board member in general, what could a member that's running, what can they realistically expect to try to affect?
Well, I agree with Diane. I think, unfortunately, the system has become so rotten. I compare the system to kind of a hydra. And so if they don't have the control of the school board, they've got the state, they've got the federal, they've got the textbook publishers, they've got the unions. So they can lose 1 or 2 of those tentacles, and all the other ones will team up to make sure. And Diane experienced that actually as superintendent of public instruction in the state of Arizona. They lost that office, but then all the other tentacles came together to ensure that the indoctrination would continue. But with that said, I think school board members can play a very valuable role, first of all, in drawing attention to what's going on. Just by virtue of being a school board member, that gives you credibility with parents, with teachers, with students in some cases, and also occasionally with the press. You know, if you're saying something that's newsworthy, very often the press will be willing to quote you. And I think that is probably the single most valuable thing that can be done. Now, with that said, I think there are some ways in which school board members can try to minimize or mitigate the damage. I still wouldn't say that it would be safe to send your children to a public school, but I'll give you the example. I'm here in Florida, so the big debate here has been about masks, and school boards have, for the most part, declined to impose these mask mandates, and that's partly because of the state. But even in districts where they wanted to impose or where they didn't want to impose the mask mandate, you had this kind of controversy going back and forth between the federal, the state, and so then local school boards were in some ways instrumental in protecting children from these abusive policies. And I don't know the specifics of Minnesota. I did try to spend a little bit of time before we started looking into that, and unfortunately, your state makes it very difficult to find out. But a lot of states are what's called local control, where the school boards, at least in theory, have a little bit more say about what books are used, what curricula is taught. And in those cases, I would say, there are some things that are very important that you could do. For example, the teaching of reading. That's a big pet peeve of mine. The federal government's own data shows that the vast majority of us are either illiterate or very close to it. Well, you as a school board member and you as a local school board can make a big issue out of that and say, look, why are we using these failed methods to teach reading? Let's switch out those tools and let's bring in new tools that are proven scientifically using systemic intensive phonics to teach our children how to read properly. And that is, it seems like a small thing, but it's a huge deal because that will give the children the tools at some point in the future to at least educate themselves if they choose to do that.
Right. Yeah, Tanya, what have you found as being a school board member? What have you been able to affect change? Because you're in the minority in your school board.
Yeah.
So how does a minority member affect change?
Well, first of all, I have to say that school boards should believe fully that they are accountable for every single thing that happens in their district, every experience a student has, every lesson plan, every piece of curriculum. I believe I am accountable at the end of the day to represent the voters in that. So one of the things that has changed, so we used to have the majority, it flipped in the last 2 years. But even with that change, we wanted to have a school board oversight of curriculum. So in the past, the school board did not have even a curriculum committee. So now we have a curriculum committee where a school board member sits on that committee. We do approve curriculum at that highest level. Now, my school district being Maple Grove, Brooklyn Park, Osseo, and parts of surrounding cities of 20,000 students, 3 high schools, 4 middle schools, and like 17 elementary schools. Certainly as at the school board level, it's through policy that we set the standards for curriculum. So in my case, we are just beginning to have greater oversight over that. In the past, we did not approve curriculum. In the past, we did not have a oversight board. But I think parents need to demand that their school board members fulfill that accountability role. When you get elected to school board, you go to training through the Minnesota School Board Association, and they do very heavily say stay in your lane. But I think all school board members should believe that we are ultimately accountable to the parents, to the stakeholders, to the constituents for every single thing that happens in our district, and through governance and policy set standards that we say what will align with our expectations for curriculum. Then through our hiring of our superintendent, you have to hire somebody and you have to have a majority who's going to hire a superintendent who is going to implement that oversight from an operational perspective. So I think we do have that authority. Whether or not school boards have asserted that authority is a different question. And I do think to the points made earlier, making that apparent and transparent to parents is what's going to move the dial. When parents begin to see the lessons that come home or have questions about it, to make that very public on what the role of a school board member should be as accountable to the parents.
Right. Yes. And Diane, I wanted to ask you too. I noticed on several people at attending school board meetings are finding that they're saying that their school board is just a rubber stamp for the superintendent. So what should a school board member be doing with not as a rubber stamp? So just kind of describe that a bit.
Okay, well, in my opinion, first of all, one of the problems, and Tanya, you mentioned it, is the State School Board Association. I know here in Arizona, when there's a new school board member, they generally go through training with ASBA, Arizona School Board Association. And what they tell those members, it's as if they totally ignore the fact that they're elected officials. They say, you're on this school board, your job is to hire the superintendent and then implement any of the policies that the superintendent wants or administration wants implemented. Well, that's exactly the flip-flop of the truth. These elected officials are supposed to come together and work on whatever the policies may be, and then tell the superintendent, you're the one that needs to implement them by majority vote. If you ask most school board members, you know, who do you represent? Generally, they'll say, well, we represent the children or
Exactly.
teachers or whatever. No, you don't. You represent the constituents who elected you.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you, Tanya, I assume Minnesota does the same thing. In Arizona, the Arizona School Board Association has basically taken over the writing of school district policies. So something goes into statute and then they hand the district a piece of paper and say, here, you know, adopt this policy. So they can have more authority, but they're being totally mistrained. In my opinion, their position as an elected official, to me, I mean, I can't, despite the problems I had, you know, as an elected official, there's no greater honor than serving the people of your community, or in my case, the state. But yet there's so few that understand what the task really takes.
Right. Did you want to comment on that, Tanya?
Yeah, I agree. We are getting a lot of model policies, and we actually had recently some policies around giving the superintendent operational authority to make COVID decisions. So many boards actually used the Minnesota School Board Association policy to not even vote on masking decisions.
Yes.
And when that came before my board, I said, I'm not beholden to the Minnesota School Board Association. I'm not going to take their policy. It really is irrelevant to me what their policy is on this matter, because this is our accountability to our families. This is going to affect every single child in our district. How could we possibly just take a boilerplate template and vote on it? So I do see that, but I think in many of the large districts, I feel like we have a little bit more autonomy than maybe some of the smaller districts that may feel that they need to take that, or don't have as many resources to write their own policies possibly, and take those and just pass them.
Yes. And
and I was just going to add to that, if I could for a moment, but one of the things that it made me think about, looking at knowing what Arizona does and now looking at Minnesota, is I have to believe these policies are not really flowing from the state. They're actually flowing from NSBA, who is now trying to nationalize, in my opinion, the philosophies of elected officials on governing boards.
yeah, very good. Julie, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just, when the people involved in dealing with these issues, so many times they feel like that they act like they haven't, they don't have any responsibility for themselves, that it's some committee that developed it. They always reference, we always go by the standards. We go by the state standards. And you look at the standards that there are, and there's some specifics in there, but they can apply them in so many different ways. So they're always passing the buck. So, I mean, I am absolutely with Tanya on that they are responsible. I also find out that they don't actually know what the curriculum is. So you're asking them questions that they don't even really know. And it's their responsibility to find out if people are asking about them. And when there are big concerns about whether it's CRT or comprehensive sex ed or whatever curriculum that they're asking about, they don't really know. I've talked to some school board members personally, and they just seem to act like that it's just not their responsibility. And it really is them to oversee it. And if we have questions about it and the school isn't giving us that information, where do we go if not to the school board members who we elected? We elected and we pay their salary.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a whole narrative that is very, off the rails, and they're allowed to get by with a narrative that does not hold themselves accountable. They're just passing the buck. And it's kind of like they're just these faces that rubber stamp everything that comes through. And the superintendent frequently acts like he's their boss instead of somebody, they hired him.
Correct.
Not to rule them, but to serve them.
Yeah. Yes. And Alex, a question just came up. It says, please give parents examples of how they can know CRT is being taught in their district when the school board or the teachers or the superintendent says it is not. So a lot of people are hearing, oh no, not here.
Yeah, and that is absolutely untrue. But you will hear that from a lot of school boards. You'll hear that from superintendents. You'll even hear that from some teachers and principals. And you're not going to find, if you look through the textbook, a big chapter labeled critical race theory. What you will find is this worldview embedded in absolutely everything, going down to the kindergarten level. And so some of them are really blatant. You'll have, for example, teachers giving students instructions to consider their power and privilege. And sometimes they'll even assign a numerical value. Did your ancestors come from Europe? Okay, are you heterosexual? Do you identify with the gender that was assigned to you at birth? And things like this. And then you give yourself points. And then you're supposed to classify yourself, whether you're an oppressor or oppressed, and how oppressed you are, whether you have multiple intersecting identities with some oppressed. So this is all founded in the ideas that underpin not just critical race theory, but also critical theory. The idea of dividing up people into these different categories. And so that's what you're really looking for. Are they dividing the children by some category? Oftentimes it's going to be by race, but not always. One of the tricks that they've developed now to really encourage the homosexuality, the gender confusion, is they'll tell the kids whose ancestors came from Europe, well, you're automatically an oppressor. But, homosexuals are oppressed and transgenders are oppressed. So, hypothetically, if you wanted to be a homosexual or a pansexual or a agender, then, you'd get some oppressed points, and, then you wouldn't be quite so rotten and evil. And they're telling this to little kids. So, you won't find critical race theory in those terms pretty much anywhere, but you'll find this underlying philosophy. You'll find it especially in history and civics. The notion that America is a white supremacist nation, that it was founded on white supremacy, that our institutions are systemically racist, that individuals, by virtue of their skin color, are either oppressors or oppressed. All these ideas, including phony narratives in your history classes, phony narratives in your civics lessons about the purpose of our laws or our institutions. All of that, I would say, falls under the banner of critical race theory, even though you'll never see it called that until, maybe a college level. And in defense, some of these teachers really don't understand that what they're doing is promoting critical race theory. A lot of them are naive. They were taught this at the College of Education, where they got a 4-year degree. So some of them naively have accepted these things, and now they're passing that on to the kids without even knowing it's critical race theory. But beware of the warning signs, and I guarantee you, if you look, you will find them in every school district in this country, including the most conservative district you could think of in Oklahoma or Nebraska or Idaho.
Yes.
So can I add on to that for a second?
Yeah.
I just think you need to recognize that the word equity basically is a principles of critical race theory, and Minnesota is saturated with equity. And it comes through some programs that the teachers are trained in, like SEED, for example, SEED, that I can't even remember the acronym stands for, but it's about equity training, and it is steeped in CRT. So if your teachers and your parents and your administrators are getting that kind of training, that is CRT training. They don't call it that. And then look at the books they read. I mean, that they have available, that they want as references. If they use references that include white fragility or anti-racism, those are two key ones. That is radical CRT. And they use those things to train the teachers and the administrators on these principles. So if they are saying that we want to view everything through an equity lens, they are talking about CRT, because it means that equity, they always say it themselves, equity is not equality. equity means giving special people special help if they need it, which sounds very sweet. And we've always done that. People that need us extra help, we give them extra help. We have whole departments that do nothing but that. However, when you separate people by identity group, and outcomes are measured by your identity group, and that is supposed to be evidence of racism, you're completely off the rails. So those are the things you can look for, the words that you want to see, such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. I mean, that's in every school. I think the State Department of Education requires that you have some kind of group like that. That is equity. So it's steeped in everything, and not just in education. It's in all our policies throughout the state.
Yeah, Tanya, what have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, it is embedded in everything. It has been for some time. I think there's been an acceleration to define your entire experience primarily through the lens of race and gender. And that's really what's, I think, accelerated this issue and this, what I would say is a problem. Instead of considering your experiences, and your race and gender is one element of that, it says it's your primary experience. And then they further build it out and tell kids what that means.
Mm-hmm.
I once was told by a teacher that I'm not a real person of color because I'm white presenting. Therefore, my lived experiences are not that of a first generation American of Mexican descent, because I present white. So if we have teachers determining what the experiences are of children in their classroom based on the pigmentation of their skin, that becomes very problematic. So certainly race and gender are one element of our life experience and the way that we encounter the world, but it's not the primary one. And that's what's really shifted. And so you need to be aware of what type of assignments are coming home, what type of questions are coming home. I've had screenshots of assignments. It's often in English class and history class where it'll ask students to write about their experiences, not just their experiences with race, but to write about a time in which they experienced either a negative impact of white privilege. I had a parent call me, and their mixed race daughter was asked to write about a time she experienced racism. And they said she didn't have anything to write, but she felt that she had to write something, so she made something up. So this is the type of pressure that kids are under to somehow develop a sense of experience that's 100% based on race in terms of how the systems in America perceive them, and how they're experiencing them from a very young age. And that's what I find very problematic. It is not the role of the education system to tell our children what they experience, or that race is the primary prism by which they experience the world around them.
So Tanya, you as a school board member, how do you know or see what is actually being taught in the classrooms? Like Alex was saying, it's not, if you don't see it in the curriculum goes by you onto the teacher, and then it gets taught in the classroom. But how are you made aware of that?
Right. We need the evidence of of an assignment that's taking place that's inconsistent with our expectations. So this is a tops down and bottoms up need. So as a school board member, if I don't have parents attending school board meetings, if I don't have parents communicating that this is a problem, I really then am alone on an island, especially as a member of the school board that's in the minority right now. So if I bring this issue forward and say, parents are telling me about this, but I have nobody standing behind me, they're going to say, you're promoting an agenda, who, like, this really isn't happening. So we really need parents to be able to begin to communicate and speak out about what their kids are experiencing. And then we're able to share that information and identify how this is inconsistent with what we're expecting in our school district.
Yeah, very good advice. I wonder too, how would you recommend parents, because I know parents feel like an island as well, and they fear, they don't know their school board members, so they don't know who to talk to. Like, how would you coach parents to come forward with these concerns to their school board?
Yeah, unfortunately, parents are afraid. They're afraid of retaliation. And in fact, I get emails and I communicate with people who don't want to have their names identified. So sometimes at a school board meeting, somebody will send me an email and I'll read the email, but not the name. So because I want the public to know that this is coming from parents, so that other people will then begin to feel more confident that they can communicate to their school board members about this. So I think school board members need to begin to publicly communicate what families are telling them. A lot of school districts also have like anonymous tip lines and things like that, but I would have to aggregate that information. It's really to the point where you can't hide anymore. You really have to say what's happening to your kids, because as a parent, you're the only person that can advocate for them. There's nobody else that's going to. It's got to be you. So we need parents really coming forward.
Yeah, good. Alex, here's another question. So what is the most effective thing taxpayers can do to stop the slow drift to the woke?
It's probably not the answer that anybody on this call wants to hear, but I would say you need to get your kids out of the public schools, period, end of discussion. That's the only thing they're going to pay attention to, is when the funding starts drying up, because they don't have any more victims to brainwash. But I think the answer that you are looking for, and I'm happy to comment on that too, is you've got to get involved at the local level. You've got to be present at the meetings. You've got to be communicating with the community so that they know what's going on. And there's a lot of ways to do that. There are, the political parties. There are meetings of different grassroots organizations. There are email lists. There are local newspapers. There are bulletin boards. And so first, gather the evidence. You figure out what is going on in the district, in your particular district, that you can draw attention to, get pictures, work with other parents, look through the textbooks that are being used, look at the worksheets that are being sent home with the children. If they're doing things on the computer, monitor that very closely, get a sample of things, and then publicize that in your local community. Get together with other parents, go protest at the school board, talk to the legislators, lawsuits if necessary. But I think ultimately the thing that is most likely to get their attention and is most likely to protect your children at this point, and I hate to say it because we're all taxpayers, we're all paying for these schools, but it's just to get your children out and then continue to do that. In fact, it's quite ironic. I think the people who are most active in these battles, as DeEtta can attest, are actually the people who are homeschooling or who are in private schools. It's a shame that that's what's going on, but part of the reason we've drifted as far is because parents have not been doing the things that they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and I think as a homeschool parent, we have dealt with curriculum, we've taught with phonics, so we can see the difference between the two techniques, and so we can see that there's a problem here where I think maybe public school parents don't know. This is what they've seen and they just don't know.
Well, parents have trusted the school system.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the school systems have begun to let them down. Now, as a public school board member and as a parent who has my children in public school, I'm not choosing to leave. And I think everybody has to make that decision for themselves. But I'm telling my kids, I am spending quite a bit of time understanding what they're learning, and I'm teaching them to be able to advocate for themselves. And so I lead a group of moms, and actually the Mama Bear kind of phenomena, I think it's a great example of how you do influence school boards. And it's moms who have never been involved before, but they saw what was happening to their children, and they began to find each other through social media, began to meet in person, and began to show up. So while I respect everybody's decision to lead the school districts, and I do think there is truth that until it hits the school district in the pocketbook, they may not change. But I think that for me personally, I think we need to stand up and we need to fight and we need to equip our kids, because there's going to be other kids that are going to see them in the classroom. They need to be the shining light. So for me, that's the choice that I'm making for myself and my children, is to be that light. And it does take time though. Like, I'm not trusting them to other people to educate them. I'm talking with them and I'm educating them in how to stand up and advocate for themselves too.
Yeah.
To kind of segue back to what can people do when you talk about going to school board meetings, which is very important. But what we found in one of the local districts, the board that I served on many years ago, what they were telling even the school board members, a lot of it wasn't revealed until one very active parent began doing public records requests. And our superintendent was standing up and saying, no, we don't have CRT. We don't have any of these things. And then it was through public records of, they had mentioned a committee. So then she did a public records request of the committee minutes. And then from the committee minutes, she was able to get into people's emails. And that's what really revealed what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to also say that when people show up at their school board meetings and reveal, or they do a records request and they find good information, they take it public at the board meeting, it's getting harder and harder to actually be heard at the school board meetings. But I think that it's important that we, as the public, support the school board members who are supporting us. And they need that support. They need that backup. They need to be communicated with. And when they are running for election and re-election, we need to get involved in those campaigns. And part of that is that the information that we uncover about what is going on in the schools has to be communicated to the public. It isn't just taking it to the school board and complaining about what they're doing, but you have to communicate it to the public. So the public is ready to elect different school board members. I mean, we can't replace them if the public doesn't know. And so all the things that we say and protest has to be through a lens of how do we communicate this to the voters out there, so that and then we have to find candidates to run. And I think it would be important if we could talk a little bit here about what it takes to run. I mean, how does that work for us? Because people like Tanya, you're going to have to face a re-election, and you need an army, and that's real practical stuff. It's not real, real snazzy. It's sometimes just, doing data entry. It's knocking on doors. It's doing the things that's what Alex is saying when he's saying get involved. I mean, it's being part of the whole process, and most people just like sit back, or they complain about, or not just complain, but they protest properly at the right time, at the right place. But then they don't really necessarily put themselves into the whole effort of everything they can do.
On the note of getting involved as well, every school district has committees. Parents have to be on those committees. We're begging parents and trying to get the word out. So we've got many different committees, curriculum committees, enrollment committees. Parents have to get on those to have a voice.
Tanya, did you want to talk a little bit about running for school board? What are some things that you had to do leading up to and the whole process?
Yeah, well, it's every school district is a different size, right? So for me, being a large school district that encompassed many Senate districts, it was a larger geographical area than somebody running for Minnesota House or Senate. So to me, it was really about, I think, I'd step back and say, first of all, I think that most voters want competent, capable, qualified school board members. They do not want political partisan school board members. And the role of a school board member should be, our schools should not be partisan. They should not be political. They should be at institutions of academic instruction. So I think it takes quite a bit of effort to become knowledgeable on educational issues. My husband was a teacher. I was a high school coach. So I had a lot of firsthand knowledge as far as what students were experiencing. You have to have a compelling reason why voters should vote for you. Not only are you qualified, but do you have an actual connection to the students that you're serving? So what is it that you're really trying to drive forward? So for me, it was all about academic excellence. To me, it was about preparing our kids for the global workforce. So at the heart of it is the substantive issues. But you do also have to be knowledgeable about the operations of the school district. But it is a lot of work. It was my kids were out with me lit dropping, out late at night lit dropping, every single night after work, all summer long parades, social media. It is a significant amount of effort and resources to run for, especially a larger school district.
One more question for you, Tanya, I have here from before. So how often does the entire school board meet as a board? And then can you tell us a little bit, do you have like a work session? So you have like your official board meeting, and then do you have like a work session meeting? What does it look like in your like average day as a school board member?
Yeah, so, and again, it depends on the size of your school district, but we typically have 2 meetings a month. One is a work session, and we don't make decisions in work sessions. So that's where it's a little bit more informal. We can really dig into a topic and understand it fully. And then the school board meeting is where we vote, we pass a consent agenda. There is quite a large just operational element to that, the finances, union contracts, There's quite a, just like, think about it as a large company, things that just you have to do to run the system. But that is where we conduct our votes. The school board meetings are where there's public comment, so where the public can come and speak to that. We also sit on committees. So on average, each of us sits on 4 different committees. So I sit on the enrollment and capacity committee, where we're discussing our capacity, our needs for growth, where we're seeing declining enrollment, where we're seeing growth, what we need to do in terms of our facilities for the long term. I also sit on our foundation committee. We actually also, many school districts oversee, we have a community education arm of it. So it does, it can be a 20-hour a week job. And then if you're out being present at school events and out talking with stakeholders, that adds on quite a bit as well.
Yeah, very good advice. Diane, there's a question here. How can parents find out what the curriculum is that is being taught in the schools? Can a non-parent citizen make such a request? It seems like there's an iron wall between what is being taught and what citizens know is going on in the schools.
Well, again, my answer comes from Arizona. So it depends on what your local laws are, what authority the legislature has given. In Arizona, we have a statute that says parents have a right to see the curriculum before a school board adopts any textbooks, or the law is outdated. So when they refer to supplemental materials in that statute, they're referring to the day when it was a textbook, and generally the publisher had a workbook to go along with it. But parents ostensibly have the right to see that, but the districts don't put it on the website. They don't make it easy. You have to, now our district, the one I was on the board, I think was 160 square miles. You had to come to the district office in order to review curriculum and books. Now, another thing we're finding, and Tanya, you may be finding this as well, is now they're getting into all the ebooks and tablets and electronic devices, and there's really no way to put those on display, and the districts complain they don't want to buy it. Here in Arizona, one of the problems is, despite the fact parents have so many rights in statute in our state, there was a Ninth Circuit Court decision called Fields v. Palmdale that basically says that parents can choose their children's school, but they lose any say over what happens in that school once their child is enrolled. So it becomes, I share that just because it becomes a very deep, complex issue. You have rights in statute, but if the districts refuse to respect those rights, at least here in Arizona, there's no consequences if they don't. So I wish I had a better answer than that, but there's not.
Right.
Minnesota has a very similar statute, and I just pulled it up. And so if you just Google, that type of a heading of parental curriculum review, Minnesota state statute. Every single parent is entitled to review any content that's going to be before their child. And so something that I've begun recommending to parents who have concerns about what their kids are being taught is to write a letter at the beginning of the school year outlining what you expect the teacher to share with you prior to it being taught. So you can cover, if it's a topic about race or gender, you can put that in a letter and you can deliver that to your teacher and say, before my child is presented with content related to these issues under state statute, I request a review of that content, any lesson plans. The good news, though, is with a lot of the move to the digital, you can see a lot of your kids' assignments right online. So my daughter, I can go in and she can show me her assignments that she's turning in, that she's doing. So in some ways, there's potentially more visibility to the assignments that our kids are having. So I think there's ways to be proactive in asserting your rights under the law as well. As far as the kind of teeth to it, I don't know a lot about that. I'm guessing that it probably is difficult to fight if the school district doesn't comply with the request.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things I did when my own daughter was in school was every teacher, every grade, I requested a syllabus at the beginning of the school year. And I also requested that they give to me any extracurricular is not the word I want, but any extra reading assignments. So now that we see these absolutely horrid books coming through, I read every book my daughter was going to be assigned before it was given to her, and to see what was in it. And not all of them were necessarily sexual or obscene, but they may have had awful worldviews in them that needed to be counteracted at home.
You can request a list of what your teacher has in their
Mhm.
classroom library. And I would hope that they would give a transparent list. You can request a conference with your teacher and you can ask to see their library when you're there. So I think parents have a lot of rights. It's a matter of asserting them and asserting them proactively.
Right.
So the question, other part of that question was whether a non-parent who's a member, a citizen of the district can request to see the curriculum. And actually that is not into the law, correct? That's parental review that you took. So you could do that with a data request.
Mm-hmm. It requires a data request because of that law I'm looking at. It speaks only to parents and guardians.
And our law in Arizona is a parent's bill of rights, but I have never seen any citizen be rejected to request information if they wanted to review a textbook or some reading materials.
Yeah, and that's been my experience too. I've asked to see their science book, their history book. I've asked to see their sex education curriculum, and they've been open about showing that to me. But I suppose if not, then you have to go and use the data request.
Or you can team up with a parent and have that requested.
Right. Yeah, very good. All right. Alex, wondering what do you think about all of this online teaching, just in general, like what Tanya was talking about with, the books being online and the kids being online learning, using YouTube to teach in the classroom, all of that.
Well, it's a double-edged sword, and I'll start off with full disclosure. I am a teacher and I teach online at the Freedom Project Academy. I teach 12th graders, high school seniors, advanced economics, and I've been doing that for over a decade now, and I enjoy it. I think there are significant downsides to the online environment, but as for what's been happening with the gradual migration to more and more happening on the computer, I'm extremely troubled by it for a number of reasons. And in fact, I've written very extensively on this for people who want to go deeper. I've done several pieces for the Epic Times on this exact topic. And I think in one sense, they are increasingly trying to push teachers out. They want to sideline and marginalize teachers and really turn them into glorified babysitters that just kind of stand in front of the room and supervise the children as they mess with their devices. And what's going on with the devices, to me, is extremely troubling. Charlotte Iserbyt, who served as the senior advisor in the Ronald Reagan administration on education, she compares what's going on with these electronic devices to high-tech Skinner boxes. The Skinner box, of course, was the operant conditioning chamber, where you were using just basic animalistic conditioning to get the animal to behave in the way that you wanted it to behave. So an electric shock when the mouse or the animal did something wrong, or a treat if the animal did something correct. And when you look at a lot of these programs, these so-called educational programs that are being used in the schools, it is the very essence of operant conditioning. The kid displays the right attitude, the right value, he gets a little happy face and a cute little song pops up. So it's positive reinforcement. And then he has the wrong attitude. Okay, well, then you get the sad face. And I'm really troubled by this. I'm also troubled by the data collection that it enables, not just because the government has no business knowing all of this information. They have absolutely no business knowing the political opinions of my child. They have absolutely no business asking my child how many sexual partners he or she has had or what gender he or she identifies with. That's none of the government's business. But even more concerning than the government vacuuming up all this data is the ways in which they're using that data collection to shift those values and those attitudes. And in fact, they talk very openly about this. They talk about, they like to use complex language so that parents feel intimidated and they don't want to sound stupid asking questions, but they talk about the affective domain. And to be clear, what they're talking about with affective domain is, what does your child believe? What are his or her attitudes and values and ethics and moral principles? And they're very clear about their desire to shift those. And so they're gathering a lot of this data using technology that, in my opinion, is absolutely out of line. They brag about these things in their own reports. They have facial expression cameras. Now, I don't know whether they're being used in Minnesota, but I know they've been used all across the country to monitor the facial expressions and the reactions that children display to various stimuli. And then they're using that to determine whether the child is exhibiting the correct response, which in their view, the correct response is having the right attitude to homosexuality or open borders or abortion or whatever the issue may be. And then they figure out, okay, this child doesn't have the correct attitudes. We need some additional intervention here. They're figuring out what's most effective. So this is, a topic I could spend an hour talking about this, but I'll say I'm extremely troubled by it. The one benefit of some of this stuff moving online is that, as Tanya explained, it has provided a little bit more transparency for parents. And I think over the COVID period, if you will, when everything was kind of moved online and kids were at home doing school through Zoom or whatever, a lot of parents, I think for the first time, discovered some of the filth, some of the wickedness that was being taught to their children. And I think this helped spark the movement that we've now seen emerging, the mama bears and parents outraged. I think it's also contributed very heavily to the fact that millions of families have fled the public school system over the last couple of years. And so I'm very encouraged by that. But I think the influx of this technology is extremely dangerous and it needs to be resisted.
And I should mention, Alex, you should tell them that the name for all of that is social emotional learning.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is what you've just described as social emotional learning is. And it comes in all kinds of nice sounding words, but he just described very well exactly what it is. It's just overwhelmingly taking over the whole psyche of the child.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Julie. Yep. And the social emotional learning is a topic I've written also very extensively about. If you want to dig deeper into that, I think I wrote one of the first, maybe the first critical investigation into SEL in a piece that I did for the Epic Times. And it didn't take me long to find out that these people are proud of what they're doing. They're bragging about how they're reprogramming your child to have new values and attitudes that are alien to those of the family. It didn't take me long to figure out that it has its roots in the occult. And I know that sounds crazy, but if you go to Castle's website, they actually bragged until recently. They just took it down, but you can go back in the archives and find it. They were bragging that the origin, the genesis of this crazy idea was out of the Fetzer Institute in Michigan, which was founded by a disciple of Alice Bailey. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. So the deeper you go, the more you find things that are just beyond outrageous, that any parent should be not just furious, but I mean, taking real concrete action to put a stop to this. And SEL, it's a huge issue. So thank you, Julie, for bringing that up.
So Alex, I'll have to ask this. So I brought the child protection lead's description of social emotional learning and their concerns about that to our superintendent and curriculum advisor. And they said that's not at all what they are doing in their schools, and that, this has been in the schools for the last 30 years. And they are just trying to help the underprivileged children, children who are struggling with their emotions, children who are struggling with, whatever. I don't know. How do you argue with that?
Well, I would say the first thing is go pull up my article on this, because I'm just quoting them. The premier resource for social emotional learning is Castle. And a lot of the information, I just literally quoted directly from their website and put it in my article. And they brag about the fact that they're instilling new attitudes on race and gender and social justice into your children. It's not me saying that, it's them bragging about it. So
we should put a link to your article, somewhere.
Yeah, I'll grab it right now and I'll put it in there. Thank you, Julie. Good idea.
Yeah, our district right now is looking at curriculums on social emotional learning. And so that will be something that comes to the board as well. But it does kind of the concept, right, is that it's universal character values and behaviors. And there is a real problem that students are arriving to the classroom, significant issues in terms of behavior. And so under the concept of improving behavior management in the school, that's kind of where it's coming in. So again, it comes with something that sounds really reasonable, and we do all want to have character and behavior expectations, certainly in our school system. But then when you dig down, it's something very different. And so I had put the websites for the 3 curriculums that we're reviewing on my school board page for people to look themselves, because I really do want people to educate themselves too and see what this is all about. Sometimes you can't, it is true. It sounds so unbelievable when you say what's in this. People look at you like you're crazy, but you have to help them go to the direct source themselves to see what's really kind of in there. And it's really not, again, it's not the role of the school system to develop value systems for students. It's the role to have an expectation of behavior and respectful behavior in the school system. Our job is not to set values for kids. That's the job of the parents.
I should say too, that, social emotion, they often use that idea that there's so many people so many children coming in and they just don't have the basics that they need on how to interact properly and blah, blah, blah. But it's for everybody. Social emotional learning is for every single student. And so it's not focused on the underprivileged or those that are especially troubled. It's focused on all of them.
And I have to bust a little bit of a myth here, because it's not just students of color that are coming in with behavior issues. And so I personally take a little bit of offense when it's framed that way by school districts, that this is about equity, because we're seeing this manifestation of behavioral issues across the board.
And at the same time, they're not willing to enforce discipline across the board properly. So there's just this explosion of everything in the classroom, because they have discipline problems, but they're not dealing with the discipline.
Right. Well, and the trouble I had in that conversation was that I agree that teachers and administrators, they need the ability to help train these kids to, behave. I mean, you can't have them running in the halls and not listening to teachers and respecting authority. But at the same time, we can't go so far into the deep end that we're teaching, like you said, values. So it's not just helping to mitigate behaviors. It's like actually inserting their value system on these kids. So like, how does the administration, the school board walk that fine line? I mean, they're both, it's necessary to address the emotions of the kids, but yet, how do you do that?
I mean, this is 101 on like parent engagement. This is a partnership between the education system and parents in terms of what our roles are. And the education system has kind of taken that over from parents. And to some degree, the parents have allowed that. So we have to have responsibility on both sides of this problem. So I think this is a case where we need to have significant parent engagement to solve this problem.
Yes. Yeah.
On the CASEL website, and that's CASEL is what that acronym is, CASEL, that heads up the whole SEL movement. They have come out recently very aggressively saying that this is really driven by equity. I mean, that was true before, but they weren't explicit about it. Now they're saying it very explicitly. We're fundamentally focused on equity. So I mean, there we are. It's the values of the race-based worldview.
Right. Let me do the $1 million question, as I call it. Let me just read it through. This was submitted to me beforehand, and then I'll have you comment on it. So it said, I won a special election that was for 1 seat. So I'm the only new school board member. The school board chair shared with me that the current school board does not trust me. They asked me if I intend to be a team player and told me I'll need to earn their trust. A lot of their distrust is because I ran on a conservative platform who clearly stated where I stand on issues. And a lot of people who supported my campaign have been vocal that they would like to see all the current members removed. We also have required masking for employees, and I need to decide my personal response to that. With that background, I think my question is how to build rapport on a school board while being strong in your own convictions and not being stifled by their unanimous voting tendencies. Also, the superintendent and board have shared with me that as a school board member, you don't have individual power, just group power, and must support board decisions once they have been made. I understand that, but would appreciate your perspective on the school board members' role and how to make progress for our schools, even when you disagree. who'd want to pick that one up?
Well,
I'll grab it.
oh, go ahead.
Okay, Diane first.
I was going to say, I'll grab at least a little part of it, and I'll share a quick story from when I was first elected to the Peoria Governing Board. And there were 3 incumbents up for election and me, and I won one of the spots. So the first time I went in for a meeting with the executive team, the superintendent and the board president was there. After a tour of the district, which they wouldn't introduce me to anyone, the board president said to me, Diane, let me tell you how we do things here in Peoria. And then she took a big exasperated look out the window and she says, first of all, no one ever runs for a school board seat until the existing members decide that they want to give up their seat. So you had no business challenging an incumbent. And she said, and then when someone actually decides they're ready to leave, then, and I don't know if you'll see this, we, meaning the board and the administration, we look around and decide what community member will be a fit for this board.
Wow.
So it was a very challenging, many votes were 4-1, 4-1, 4-1, and that's the way it is. But, you know, how you build rapport is, in my opinion, you look for the issues you can agree upon. When you disagree pleasantly as possible. You know, you're still strong in your values and your convictions, but you have to recognize the way some of these boards are set up, and more in Arizona are than not, that they're more on the side of the administration and of the district than they are of the parents. But one of the things I was adamant about, and Tanya, you'll find this with your state school board association, that's one of, to me, the misnomers that they said. Yes, you only have power as a board, taking, you know, majority vote of the board, but because a board votes to do something like implement masks, let's use that as a great current example. So the board votes by majority to implement masks for students and teachers and whoever. Just because they voted to do it, you can't undo it as an individual board member. But I would be darned as an individual board member that I would say I agree with that decision. I would still be out in the community telling the parents and the community members, this was the decision. I can't undo it, but I don't agree with it. And I need more members to help change that decision.
Tanya?
Right. I completely agree. We have a lot of 4-2 decisions on my board right now. And, you know, I'm not going to go out there and be rude to my other board members, but I am going to be very strong about what my perspective was, why I voted the way I did, and what I'm going to continue to do going forward. And so after school board meetings, I do frequently share on my social media that what the vote was, again, why I voted it that way, and I'll continue to vote that way. So you don't have to be rude or mean or nasty, but you, for that one member, that person was elected by the constituents. Therefore, they have as much validity in their perspective and their views as being elected as any other school board member on that board. So they shouldn't feel compelled that they have to prove themselves to anybody else on that board. Who cares if the other board members trust you? You're not there for them or their trust. You're there to represent constituents who elected you. And in fact, if those other board members thought about it, they might be a little concerned that maybe they're not representing their constituents if this new person was elected with a different perspective. So I think you can be very clear, you can be objective, and you can be data informed in why you vote. You don't want to make it an emotional issue or a political issue. You just are objective and thoughtful, and you share why you stand where you stand.
So Tanya, you mentioned on your, you mentioned this online. So is that how you reach out to your constituents? How do you communicate and hear from your constituents?
Yeah, well, certainly we've heard more from constituents than we ever have before. My first year on the board before COVID, if you realize the COVID pandemic situation has now affected, this is our 3rd school year because of the timing of when it started. 3 school years.
Yes.
So prior to that, I didn't receive any emails. Nobody came to the board meeting. So that's completely changed. And I hope it stays that way. I hope people stay engaged and stay communicating. So I'll typically respond back to people who email and tell them to continue to tell others to be engaged. So I'll respond individually when I can to emails. It's a little tougher when you get like 200 at one time, but, and then through social media. And Instagram, like all of the different assets of social media.
So how do you deal with parents that are very excitable and maybe a bit maybe rude? How do you like filter all that as a school board member, from either direction?
Well, first of all, I come from a perspective that parents have a right to be emotional and passionate about their kids. It's their kids. And at my last board meeting, I said, look, the students in our district are not our kids. It's their kids. It's they are the parents. So they have a right to come in and be passionate. And when you respect their point of view and treat them with respect, you really don't have a lot of issues from parents. I've seen very rare kind of over the top type of situations, because when people think that when they know that you're actually listening to them and that their voice matters to you, then it's not a confrontational situation. So to me, no matter what somebody's coming in to talk about, whether I agree with them or not, it's their children that we're affecting. So I treat everybody with the full respect as a parent and having that parental right over what's happening to their child.
Yeah, very, very good. Does anyone else have a comment that's just burning in their heart right now that they want to bring forth?
I think to me, I really hope the engagement doesn't stop from parents. Again, I go back to, there's nobody who's going to advocate for your child except you. Don't stop. Even if you feel like the board's not listening to you, if you don't think that you're making headway, don't stop. Find other people, talk to the other parents that come to the school board meeting. Notice who's commenting on your social media. If you're posting in a school board group, get connected to them. You are not alone. When I first formed a group of women who were kind of a mama bear group, they thought they were alone. People really think that they were alone. And so getting connected, proactively getting connected is so important. And don't stop. Never stop advocating for your child.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I used to write that as a board member. We were given a little op-ed in the lunch menu. And I'd always write that at the end. Remember, school board members, administrators have to advocate for all the children. Only you can advocate for your own child. And one of the things, and I think we may be in a little bit of a different time now, the way people are coming forth, but I would always try to tell parents, try to follow the chain of command as best you can. If there's a problem with something your child's being assigned to read, go to that teacher, because like Alex said, many of these teachers don't even realize the worldviews and the underpinnings of some of the things they're teaching. And sometimes you can go to them and resolve the smaller issues very locally, very close to home, very in your child's classroom. And then if it doesn't work, keeping going up. We're talking about things like mask mandates. Of course, they're much bigger district issues, but a lot can be done very close to your child and your child's teacher.
Yeah, Tanya, I think that was good advice, that as a school board member, to realize that parents have the right to be passionate and just treat them with respect, and that just kind of deflates the situation. And looking at this other question, I think you'd be good at this one too. It says, it seems that school boards are tired of hearing from parents. They're overwhelmed, etc. And I have to say, I think as parents and community members, we're just reacting out of shock. And I think school boards are also shocked at the reaction. So I think we've kind of gone beyond the shock value. And now, how is it that we can now better communicate together and work together rather than, talking at each other, is really, I think, the basis of her question.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think this is a new experience for most board members. Like I said, they've been used to no one showing up at their meetings. They haven't really been put in these situations before. Right. So the natural tendency of a human, I think, is to defend and kind of want to like push everybody away. So there's actually some school boards who have put some very inappropriate measures in to silence families, and that's only going to make the problem worse.
Yes.
So I think if you're getting a lot of people coming to your board meetings, you really probably need to set up another forum so that they can have an opportunity to have their voice heard. If they're coming, clearly you haven't heard them. Clearly you're not listening to them. So there can be other forums. We set up listening sessions. You can set up many things so that people have the opportunity to have their voice heard. Because if they're coming, there's a problem, and it's you as a school board are responsible for creating the forum that can have their voices heard.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we also have to recognize that the teachers union, the Minnesota Education Minnesota, as well as the National School Board Association the National Education Association are not friends to us. They are very hostile in their ideology as an organization. Teachers individually, that's not true. I mean, some of them are, some of them aren't. We got wonderful teachers, but it's the organization drives a radical agenda. They're ideological, they're political. And we have to recognize that a lot of the school board members have been picked to run and to win by the school, by the teachers union. And they have that whole organization behind them. And there hasn't been a counter organization to be able to, to counter that as far as the elections. Being elected to a school board without the endorsement of the teachers union is very difficult. And so that's why there are so many school board members who are very radical, because they have been chosen to be there by the teachers union. And so when we're talking about transparency, and talking to each other and hearing each other and not talking past each other, when you have school board members who are there because they have an ideological political agenda, they're not interested in hearing from the public. They do not want to hear from the public. They will be happy to hear from left-wing groups. They'll welcome them in. They bring them in and they get counsel from them and things. But this isn't a broad brush against all school board members. Obviously, we have wonderful school board members, but it's difficult to win if you're not endorsed by the teachers union. So, when we're talking about not being able to communicate with each other, that's part of the problem, is that we don't necessarily have the same goals in mind as some of them who are there. And the majority frequently is, when you have, a mixed bag of conservative and not conservative, the majority frequently, or most of the time, is those the teachers union have put in there. So that you've got a built-in conflict, and that we just have to recognize that, you can communicate with people who will communicate with you, and you won't communicate with those who do not want to hear from you.
Yeah. Hey, Alex, here's a question for you. It says, would real school choice laws, where tax dollars follow the kids to the school of their choice with no strings attached, be the most effective way to force public schools to change course and offer a better product? Diane, I think you probably want to comment on that too. So, Alex, what do you think about school choice and tax dollars? Is there a way to separate that somehow?
Well, thank you for the question. And it's another issue I've thought about a lot and written about extensively. My biggest concern with that is that it may end up destroying true school choice. And I say that because I've seen it happen. In fact, I was living in Sweden when they passed a law closing the trap. So I see the money for the private schools and even for the homeschoolers as kind of the cheese in the mousetrap. And the parents go and they think, oh, free money, I think I'll grab that. And then they eat the money, and then, they're stuck. And that's my biggest concern. The courts have ruled consistently, and people are inclined to agree that what the government funds, the government has the authority to regulate. And so if the government is funding our private schools, if the government is funding our home schools, there's a very, very real risk that they will say, well, we can't have public dollars going to a school that teaches that the Bible is true, or that won't hire a man in a dress to teach kindergartners. And so there's a real risk there. I've seen it happen. If in a perfect world, we could absolutely guarantee positively that there would be no regulation associated with the money, Okay, that's understandable. In fact, we have a program in Florida right now called the Hope Scholarship, which is becoming increasingly popular. It allows any parent, for virtually any reason, they just have to sign a paper that says their child felt bullied or intimidated. That could be, someone told them to wear a mask, somebody called them a poo-poo head. It doesn't matter. It's not an optional thing. They have to give you the money if you take it. It's called the Hope Scholarship, and it's about $7,000, and then you can take that to the private school of your choice. And it's working very well. A lot of families have fled the government school system using that money. But about maybe a year or two ago, it was like there was a coordinated memo sent out because all the big newspapers in the state, almost on the same day, published editorials and op-eds and columns saying that, oh, well, all these schools are getting government money, and yet they're teaching the kids that Noah's Ark was real, and they're discriminating because they don't want transgenders teaching their kindergarten kids. We have to bring in standards and accountability, and they have to obey the government rules. So that's the real big concern. Honestly, I think the true goal, the true objective in my mind is for parents to once again assume full and total control over the education of your children. Just like you have to feed your kids, just like you have to put your kids to bed, you should be in charge of educating your kids. And if you want to delegate part of that responsibility to somebody else, that's fine, but you should not expect anybody else to pay for it. So that's ultimately my position. I think there may be some desirable elements of this school choice thing, but ultimately I think the risk is so huge and the consequences so catastrophic if we lose this battle in terms of losing our freedom to homeschool and losing our freedom to have Christian schools, that it's too dangerous to risk.
Yeah.
I think those are very fair points. I would also say that some of the challenges, especially around CRT in the public school system, are also in the private school system. I've seen parents leave public school believing that it was going to be different in private school, and they encountered it even worse in some of the private schools. So faith institutions have completely had this some of this racial thinking completely become injected into their curriculums as well. So this is not just a public school fight, it's also a private school fight.
Yeah, true.
Well, and because many of the teachers who are in the private schools are trained the same way that our government school teachers are trained, so you're not going to see it leaving. I think Alex and I have kind of had this discussion back and forth a little bit. One of the conundrums, we have empowerment scholarship accounts here in Arizona, and a parent can take them to a private school, they can homeschool with them, do as they choose, but we have very limited categories of children who qualify for them. And where I like that philosophy, and I believe in that philosophy, to Alex's point, is once the government is the collector, the holder, the disperser of the money, then they immediately get into writing the rules of how it'll be done. So my $1 million question or $64,000 question is, how do we get the funding for educating our children? Because many families can't, they don't have the resources for whatever reason, or we've become so addicted to education should be free and it should be given to children, one of our kind of philosophies. So how do we get enough money into the system if we don't do it through taxation or government compensation? And that's a rhetorical question, because as a finance person, my mind has been going around that for years now, that if we tell people we're no longer going to tax to fund an education system, do you think grandma and grandpa are still going to give that $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to a scholarship account? We have those here in Arizona, but we don't see them making the kind of money that they have. So I don't know how you get that funding for the children and how you get that assistance, shall we call it, to the parents without the government being involved. But I absolutely see how detrimental the government has been to our system so far. And if they can knock down, even here in Arizona, if they can knock down any school choice, they'll do it in a heartbeat, whether it's homeschooling or through our public school exit. We talk about trying to get our churches back involved. In most of the education was through churches or private tutors back in the day, and we don't do that anymore because our churches have given up.
I mean, COVID did present some opportunity for learning. I did hear situations where families got together and hired a teacher. So I think that there is an opportunity of openness to encourage parents that there are other models potentially. But I do come back to Alex's original point where it's, as parents, this is our accountability. The education of our children, it's like all of our other parental accountabilities, like who's their friends, who's teaching them at their school, what are they learning at church? These are questions that we are the first educators. So regardless of whether they're in a private school, a public school, or a homeschool co-op, it still is our responsibility. And that's a little bit of a breakdown, honestly, in our society, that parents have not taken control of that authority and accountability for their kids.
And I've often said to parents, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Did parents back off on parenting because the school district said, hey, just bring your kids to us and we'll take care of all of it for you? So, or did schools start taking over that responsibility because, you know, back in the day, women's lib, hey, women, you don't have to be home raising your children, you know, get out, go earn a buck. And I think they really tried to take it over more than parents tried to give it up, in my opinion.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to throw just one more thing out there. You know, the system as it exists, it doesn't make sense on the surface of things. Like you look at, you know, we all agree, okay, there are some people who can't quite afford food. And so as a society, as a civilized people, we need to figure out what we do about that. And historically, we've had charitable programs. The government did end up stepping in, but they never said, hey, some people can't afford food, so the government should run all the grocery stores. And actually, why don't we take over all the farms while we're at it? Because we know that leads to disaster. We've seen it in North Korea and in Cuba and in the Soviet Union and Venezuela right now. So there's no reason why the fact that a handful of people can't afford a decent education for their children should compel us to create the kind of monster we've created. And so that brings us to solutions. Now, there are a number of states that we've looked at that have really interesting programs where the money never actually goes to the government. And I think those are at least worth looking at. The state of Illinois has one. The state of Virginia has one. They actually allow parents and even companies to write off a big chunk of their tax bill if they give that money to, they have different names for the organizations. In Illinois, they're called SGOs. I forget exactly what that stands for, but an individual, say, who has a $1,000 tax liability, or say a $750 tax liability, could write a $1,000 check to one of these SGOs. They're private organizations controlled by a board of directors. They're nonprofit, and they provide scholarships for low-income children to attend parochial schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, whatever it is. And in that case, the money never goes to the state of Illinois. And so what the courts have ruled, and we've talked to some attorneys about this and stuff, and they say there's a much better argument to be made than that the state has no lawful authority to come in and then regulate those schools, because the money was never theirs to begin with. It went from the parent to the SGO to the school without ever entering a government coffer. So if, you know, as a transition, we need to move into something like that, I think that would probably be more worth looking at than just the thing where the government says, hey, every parent gets, you know, $8,000 every year and do whatever you want with it, because that's when the control is going to come in.
Well, and Alex, we have those in Arizona too. We call them school tuition organizations.
Oh,
But
okay.
what you find, even with the tax write-off incentive, the donations are not nearly what it would take, you know, to provide a scholarship for every child to be educated. And the other thing you have to remember is that there's probably, I don't know that it's 50%, but some high degree of parents out there that think what our government schools are doing is perfectly acceptable. I can't tell you how many parents I talk to and they still say, oh yeah, I'm fine with the school teaching my child sex education or social emotional learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tanya, question for you. One of our school board members suggested having a town hall type meeting where parents can ask questions and the board member must give them an answer. Are there other options whereby voters can get answers from school board members? So have you ever heard of, heard of an example of like a town hall meeting, first of all, and do you have other ideas?
Yeah, so the first challenge is open meeting law. So we can't have our board members in a public setting having a discussion unless it's there's been a meeting posting, it's for the public to see. So that creates some very real challenges. We aren't like legislators. We actually have far more rules on us. So at our listening sessions, we can only ask clarifying questions. We can't respond back really for the most part, because we could then begin violating our open meeting law. But we also could have, in this case, an option might be, could a non-quorum group of school board members host individual meetings possibly. But I do think coming to public comment and in raising questions to your school board members or inviting them to come and speak with you or a group, we're out. It's actually, some school board members have begun to claim they can't do that, which is a lie. But you can form a group of parents and say, come to our house as school board member ABC, and come and talk with us. And then if they refuse, you can put that out publicly that you invited them to come and speak and they refused. So I think there are some things that you can do to put pressure on them. I would be shocked I have been shocked when I hear school board members don't want to meet with their constituents. That's an abdication of duty.
Yeah. Do you think that's because they don't understand who they represent? Maybe. I mean, do you think it's just lack
fear.
of and fear
think,
too?
Yeah, I think it's honestly fear, and I don't think people have really saw themselves as an elected official in this capacity because it has been such a maybe non-controversial role in the past.
Exactly, and that's probably not what they signed up for when they were first elected.
Yeah, well, I signed up for it. I knew what my expectations were, but a lot of other people did not.
Yes, exactly. Another question for you, Alex. So they're asking, could the rise in school shootings and school violence be attributed to the progressive teachings that are going on? And I would say to the gender confusion also. Is this just a byproduct of this woke system that is going through our schools?
I would say without any hesitation, absolutely. There's no question in my mind. It should be an indisputable fact. We had no school shootings in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. Now they've become a regular occurrence. Now we see it on the news like, oh, another one. Great.
Yeah.
And I think it's a product of the whole worldview that our children are being taught. They are literally being taught that they came from slime, that life has essentially no meaning. Your pet goldfish, the life of your pet goldfish is just as valuable as your life. There is no ultimate purpose. There is no transcendent goal, system of morality, anything. And then that's compounded by the fact. So this scrambles the minds of the kids.
Yeah.
It teaches them nihilism. It teaches them that life is completely meaningless. And then we compound that problem by drugging them. I am 100% convinced at this point that a lot of these psychotropic medications that children are being put on, not because they have anything wrong with their brain, because they're having their brains messed up in the school system. When you add these psychotropic drugs to the mix, you can read the warning labels right in the box. It says it may cause homicidal ideation. It may cause suicidal ideation. So all these things that historically have never existed, not just in America, but in the world, the idea that kids would commit suicide, the idea that kids would murder each other. This is just absolutely unprecedented. I think it is 100% a result of what is being taught to the children, and then adding fuel to the fire is bringing in all these dangerous psychotropic medications to treat the problems that the schools are causing in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, our youth really are in a state of crisis, and before I was a school board member, like I said, I was a coach and a Sunday school teacher. And so this is something that the school system cannot solve the youth crisis issue. And I do think Alex has some really strong points about kind of even how schools have implemented so much confusion that a lot of the mental health crisis is coming from that confusion in the school system and what they're being taught about what their identity is. And that's really what it is. Our kids have lost their course on who they are, what their identity is. And the value that they have. And so in my community in particular, we have youth violence through the roof. And I did a ride along with one of our police officers, and really one of his thought processes on this was that we've told our youth that the system is against them,
Yeah.
particular segments of our youth, that the only way that you can have a voice and make an impact is through violence and damage, and through a means that really is destructive. That's the only way you're going to have your voice heard, that you don't matter, that the system is against you. That's really creating an idea of hopelessness, and it's devaluing them. So I think that the answer has to come from the full community surround of parents, the faith community, and a change in education, because the degree of crisis that our youth are in, it is not going to be solved by any one segment of our institutions. It has to have some change across every asset of it. And so our mayor is championing an effort for youth mentorship. So that's one area that we're really trying to drive some engagement in. But we have to act, and it has to not just be one institution, it's all of them that need to get engaged.
Yeah. Julie, did you want to comment on that as well?
No, I thought Alex has just put it in a nutshell. I don't think I can add to that.
Very good.
And Tanya.
Yes. All right. Here's another question. In Minnesota, how much impact does the school board have on curriculum development? And because the curriculum's online now, do they cater curriculum to certain states like they used to? And maybe this is more Alex's question too, but between the two of you, what does the school board have as far as the curriculum development and implementation in the schools?
Well, Tanya, why don't you go first, because you're familiar with Minnesota, and then I'll pick up on what I've seen. So.
Right. So we do routine curriculum reviews, especially if we're seeing that our test scores are moving in the wrong direction. That's an indication that we're maybe not meeting the standards that we're expected to meet. So every periodic number of years, anytime the state standards change, we'll have a potential curriculum adoption. We do a pilot of the curriculums, we evaluate the results, and then we select them. But at the highest level, we're rarely seeing the individual lesson plans. As I mentioned earlier, this is something that we need to have more oversight of. I think school boards absolutely have that accountability and prerogative. It's a matter of putting in place the means and the mechanisms to actually implement that oversight.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my experience, what I've observed in speaking with school board members, even state school board members all across the country, the school boards and even the state school boards play very little role in the actual establishing of curricula. In fact, I would say the overwhelming majority of it is coming from outside sources. Really, the textbooks and the curricular resources that are going along with that, those are for the most part what determines what's going to be taught in a classroom. Now, each teacher will teach it a little bit different, and they'll add some of their own experience and some of their own knowledge to what's in the book. But honestly, what's in the textbooks is really what's going to guide the teachers. And if you look at the textbooks, they are terrible. They are a disaster. And this is true in Texas. This is true in Florida. And if you look at the textbook publishers, Pearson is one of the big ones. They're anti-American. They don't share the values of mainstream America. They're really, I think, designed to weaponize the kids. And it's not that the school board is going to come in and say, okay, well, we've got to rewrite the curriculum so that it's more patriotic, or so that it's less hostile to American institutions. That's just not going to happen. I think really it's unaccountable outside entities that are really dictating the bulk of what happens in the classroom and the curricula. Teachers are more there nowadays as kind of facilitators and implementers. And then, the state governments sometimes play a role by establishing the standards. And we know those are coming from the federal government. Common Core bribed and bludgeoned the states into taking the Common Core standards. And then the textbook publishing companies adapted their textbooks slightly to meet those standards. The local school board has almost no say in what happens there. And that's a shame, because as Tanya said, we really should be looking to the local school board as having some of the accountability over what's going on in the classroom. And yet in the real world, that's simply not happening.
Yeah, Kelly, you had a few questions you wanted to bring up.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions in the chat. What happens when trying to set good policy for curriculum? The policy goes against unethical state standards. How do good school boards deal with this?
Well, the school boards we just talked about, aren't really setting the curriculum.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think so. I think there's been a lot of good work to bring more information on the state standards. So I think every single school board member should be reviewing those state standards. And if you haven't looked at them before, they're getting more and more detailed. And of course, with comprehensive sex education, that's even kind of mandating a curriculum, which goes even further. So I think that school board members need to familiarize themselves with the actual content in the state standards. And then when you get to that curriculum conversation, you need to bring that to light and you need to bring that forward. You need to ask the questions. That's, as was mentioned earlier by others, that's one of our most powerful tools, is bringing the transparency to it and asking the question, well, how are we going to teach this? I'm concerned about this standard. How do we envision this being implemented in our district, and to do it in that public forum to bring attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then on those same lines, there's another question. It seems much of policy is driven by state legislation. How can local school boards stand up to it?
A lot of the policy is coming down from state legislatures, and they're really getting that from the federal government. And I mean, don't believe me, the federal government's been openly cooperating with UNESCO and the United Nations on these issues for many years, and they were bragging about it. They were proud of it. Arne Duncan was running around the world celebrating that the UNESCO was his partner in doing this. So there's different models that states have for the way their education systems are run. There are some states that are, they're sometimes called kind of local control, where the local school district is supposed to be the final authority on what's taught there. Other states don't have that. Other states, their legislative systems and sometimes even their constitutions put the state in a superior position to the local school boards. But I would say, it is absolutely the role of lesser magistrates, if you will, in this case, school board members, to interpose. And so if the state comes out with legislation that says you must teach second graders about proper condom use, it is absolutely, I don't care what the state law says or even the state constitution, it is absolutely the role of a school board member to say, that's not going to happen here on my watch. If there's anything I can do about it, and we're going to pass a policy saying no. And if you want to take us to court, fine, take us to court. We'll fight it out in court. And if we lose there, we're still going to do everything we can to protect our children, because that's wrong. It's immoral. And who knows, maybe the embarrassment of being called out and having to go to court to defend teaching proper condom use to a second grader would cause the state to back down. So, and I think this is true, not just for school boards. We need to really, in this country, go back to a proper understanding of the role of government. And when a higher magistrate is doing something that's wrong or evil or immoral, even if it's technically legal, right? Everything Hitler did was legal. Those lesser magistrates, whether that be your governor, your mayor, or your school board member, need to throw everything they can into the gears of this machine and say, we're going to do everything we can to stop it, even if it's technically not in accordance with the state law on proper educational procedures. So,
yeah, Alex, do you hold on just 1 second? Alex, do you have like a resource or a link or something that talks about the proper role of government? Because honestly, I've tried looking into different areas in that vein, and it's hard to find.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's at some point you say, well, it's a personal preference. What do you think the role of government should be? But I think in America, the role of government was clearly defined by our founders. It's in our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. The role of the government is to protect our right to life, to liberty, to property, et cetera. It's not to micromanage our lives. It's not to tell us what we need to inject in ourselves. And it's not to teach our children proper condom usage in second grade. So that's simple. But on this topic of lesser magistrates interposing, there's a book that I would recommend incredibly highly to everyone. It's by a pastor in Wisconsin. It's a Christian book written from a Christian perspective, and it uses a lot of biblical arguments and theological arguments, but it's called The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates. In the Bible, you clearly find this over and over again. If you go back to even in Exodus, right, the Pharaoh tells the Hebrew midwives to kill all the baby boys. And the Hebrew midwives interpose and they say, no, we're not going to do that. And you go all the way through the Bible and you find constant examples of good people standing in between innocent victims and a higher power. And so this doctrine was really formulated very clearly during the Reformation in Europe, where you had these German princes that were standing in the way and protecting the religious liberties of their people. And our founders understood this very clearly. And I think we need to get back to that understanding that just because somebody above, president, governor, state legislature, makes some law or some order or some decree, that doesn't mean that we all just need to blindly follow it. So I'd highly recommend that book for any Christians who are looking for guidance on this question. It's called The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates. And it's written by Pastor, how can his name escape me right now? I know him, so I'll think about it and I'll type it in the chat.
Okay.
I was going to mention something on that. I just really appreciate your comments on that, Alex. But another approach to that whole question is that, what the state says that you have to teach, teachers have a lot of influence in what is actually taught. And you can teach these subjects and give it some context. And if you really want to teach some, like the founding documents as, what they are, you can put that in there. And but a lot of the teachers are taking their opportunity here and just running with the most radical definition of it. So there's an awful lot that they could do. And I'm going to give an example of that in that, somebody asked the question in here somewhere about the teachers are required to teach CRT. That's their training now. It's not exactly right. That's the impression that is being given, but the state has got through a requirement that teachers, in order to be accredited, have to take classes in cultural competency. Okay, so yeah, cultural competency is another buzzword for CRT. But what happens is that the left takes that word and they define it according to what they want it to mean. The requirement in that training isn't that. I know we, Child Protection League, battled this whole cultural competency for teachers. And in the end, the teachers are not required to be taught CRT as under the banner of cultural competency. But the left has put all of CRT under that umbrella. And that's the way they're training the teachers. The teachers don't have to be trained that way, but all of the people who are doing the training is also the left. It comes from all the nonprofit organizations that are out there doing the teaching and the teachers union. So what I'm trying to say is that cultural competency does not have to mean CRT in the actual teaching that they do. The state doesn't require that, even though the Department of Education basically says it does. So teachers have a lot of leeway, is what I'm saying. And what they do is that they bring in a lot of bad stuff that they don't have to bring in, but they are taking that liberty. The left is to just bring in all the literary. They choose their literary books. Nobody but them chooses which books they're going to use, and that makes a big difference. So anyway, I just want you to know that there's more leeway there than sometimes they make out to be.
All right, Kelly, you had one more question, and then maybe we can do closing comments.
Yeah, I have one more question, and there are still a few more questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
My last question was, what is the proper role of the superintendent with the school board? Because some superintendents seem to have a really large ego and are totally out of whack on their power. Maybe Tanya wants to answer that.
We touched on this earlier, I think. So they are the one employee that the school board hires. So I think of them as a CEO for our district. But that doesn't mean that we should not have a full and thorough understanding of our operations and have accountability for every single thing that happens in our district. It is who we put that accountability through. We hire the superintendent, he's accountable to us. And if something's not going, if something's not working in the district, he's accountable, or she, and we should hire and fire that person accordingly and hold them accountable to following the directives of the school board.
Tanya, here's another question that just came in. What are the top 5 or let's say top 3 responsibilities and powers of a school board member? So what do you think are the top 3?
So policy, we set and approve policy. Financial matters, we levy taxes, we set financial parameters for the school district. And then really it's the governance and oversight of all of the operations of the district. And so it's the strategy, it's the hiring of the CEO. We do sit at this very high level, but that does not excuse us for accountability for everything that happens below us.
Mm-hmm. Diane, did you have something to add to that?
No, I would agree with that.
Good.
You know, absolutely budget and finance, the policies, and hiring the superintendent, but then holding the superintendent accountable to the governing board, not the governing board accountable to the superintendent and administration.
Okay. I can't remember if we read this one. It says, what happens when trying to set good policy for curriculum? The new policy goes against unethical state standards. So how does the school board deal with this?
Yeah, we read that one already.
Did we read that one? I thought
Yep.
so. Yeah. Okay. Let's see down here. Let me pull this one up. Are there other resources for curriculum and textbooks, such as Hillsdale or more conservative sources? So can school boards actually drive the curriculum toward more conservative curriculums, or do they just have to vote on what the curriculum committee gives you? Tanya, do you know?
So, I mean, we certainly suggest things to our superintendent. So if there's a curriculum that's out there, we can suggest it, we can learn about it, we can refer it to our superintendent, we could advocate for it. Again, at the end of the day, we are the ones that should be accountable for the curriculum and adopting it. So there's certainly a wide open set of options that a district can adopt.
So there again, the parents could be communicating that with their school board, and then you can be communicating that also.
Yeah, actually a good example is our literacy program. It's really not working for a large number of our students. There's some better options that serve students with dyslexia. So that's one that we've had some parents really strongly advocating for, and have brought it up through the curriculum committee as well. So being able to be on those committees, inform those committees, make suggestions in those committees is another way that has come up.
Very good. In OSSEO, do the school board members actually look at the curriculum before they vote on it, or do they just trust the curriculum committee?
So again, like this is very new to us. We're just putting this oversight in place.
Mm-hmm.
And so we typically have a very high level description of it. We have the information on how it was piloted. We don't see the book per se.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen the book.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have a new committee that we do have a school board member on, and we are putting in place those measures so that we have more oversight of it.
Okay. Alex, can you briefly describe the relationship between the state, the teachers union, and the individual school boards? I've heard conflicting information about how influential they are in policy and curriculum decisions.
Well, a lot is going to depend on what state you're in. But, I described early on in this webinar, a kind of a hydra, and all the tentacles ultimately are connected. And what happens is you could get rid of, a lot of people say, well, if we could just get rid of the teachers unions, then everything would be fine. And I say, no, we're dealing with a hydra. You chop off one tentacle and the monster would still be there devouring children. You just lost one tentacle, but the organism will survive and continue to thrive. So depending on what state you're in, the relationship between the state and the local district and what happens in the classroom will be a little bit different. But I mean, if we're honest now, a lot of the direction is coming from Washington, D.C. They provide a very small amount of the funding, depending on what state you're in. It's usually less than 10%, believe it or not. And yet with that 10%, they're buying control over what standards your state is using. Of course, everything then gets aligned with those standards. All the tests get aligned with those standards. And so everything that happens in the classroom has to be aligned with those standards and with those tests. So the control at this point, I would say, is really not even with the state or with the local government anymore. Now, sometimes the state or the local government will go, and by local government, I mean the school district, will go a step further in terms of radical curriculum, in terms of grotesque sexual education. But the basic framework is coming down from higher up than the state or the local level. You know, the teachers unions are great at helping to get their minions elected to the school board, helping to make sure that there's a smooth process where there's not too many questions being asked, there's not too much noise being made, not too many parents finding out what's going on. And so the unions really play a big role in helping to kind of smooth it all out. But ultimately, I wouldn't say that the unions are the problem any more than I would say that local school districts or the states are the problems. It's this system that is the problem, and the tentacles are just functioning parts of the system.
Good. So then does that then give a little more power to the school boards and actually getting on those school boards and making an effect there?
Well, you know, again, I think there are some useful things that school boards can do to mitigate some of the damage. But I tell this to people all the time, even if you could get 5 out of 5 amazing individuals who know about good education, who want good education, they would be powerless to ultimately do what needs to be done. They may be able to force phonics into the classroom so that those children will learn how to read, and then maybe they can educate themselves in the future. But there's no way that you can roll back 80 years of disastrous so-called education just by winning control of the school. And I've seen it happen. I've given talks in districts where the entire school board is conservative Christians, liberty-minded people who want the best thing for the children, people who don't want this stuff. And yet then they say, well, the state law or the federal courts, or, you know, we can't have that because federal court ruling in 1982 said such and such and such. So they've made it to where it is impossible. And people get so mad at me for saying that, but it's true. They've made it to where it's impossible. Even if we could take over the whole state school board and the whole local school board, kids would still be being dumbed down and indoctrinated and destroyed in the classroom. And it's frustrating to hear that. I know it makes it much more difficult because there's no simple solution. It's not, oh, I'm going to go out and get a new person on the school board and then everything's going to be fixed. I recognize all that, but I just want to be honest with you and tell you the truth.
Yeah.
Well, and the other piece of that truth, I find, Alex, is that so many people, even when you get a conservative school board and you've got Republicans or Christians or however you want to identify them, they're afraid to stand against the problems of public education. I mean, almost every conservative I can think of, when we talk about a problem in education, they said, oh, but I support the public schools, but blah, blah, blah. And until they're really willing to recognize how deep the problems go, it's very, very hard to change it. I've been on school board. When I was on school board, we had some conservative Christian Republicans, but they lost those values when they got on the school board.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it took a lot of years to create this
Mm-hmm.
situation that we face, and it is going to take a lot of time to undo it. So, I mean, I'm staying in the battle,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, it will take time, but I'm not ready to walk away from that. And you can win the argument. It's not a partisan issue. It's not conservative or liberal necessarily. I think it's about, what does academic excellence look like? And when you are really singly focused on what education should be,
Yes.
I think you can bring a lot of people with you to drive that change. So that's really kind of my avenue of asking a lot of questions about the policies, the curriculum. It's really, what is our goal we all say that we're aiming for, and then exposing whether or not what's coming before us is actually going to deliver on that goal. And that's something that most families are going to get behind, that we really want this to be about a high quality, rigorous education, and staying laser focused on that.
Yeah, it is about a re-educating in the other direction. And that, as you said too, is going to take a lot of time as well. So I am thinking we should probably wrap up with some closing comments. What do you say, Kelly?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We're been about 2 hours now.
Yeah. So who would like to go first? If there's just one more thing that you'd like to make sure that people running for school board or interested in running for school board or attending school board meetings, what is it that they really need to know? How can they really make a difference? Who'd like to go first?
So I'll take, so parting thoughts on, we need to enlist good quality candidates to run, and then we need to equip them and educate them. And I see in the comments, there was Community Solutions is one group that does that. There's a lot of different groups that are forming to train school board members and equip them. And as Julie mentioned, we do need a support, we need a big support structure because the union does fund, endorse, and run campaigns for candidates. So I think there's, I'm personally working on an effort to get a good resource list and bring these efforts together, whether it's Center for American Experiment. I've got a panel on that on Saturday and a debrief of the last election. So I really want to begin to get all of these interested groups and coalesce them into a place where candidates can go and get resources and the support and get educated so they can run effective campaigns.
Yes, very good. How would anyone part of this webinar follow you to find that information once you get that pulled together?
Yeah, so if you go to, I have two things. I have greenbuyingstrategies.com is my business, and I'm just getting that out there, but Tanya M. Simons @gmail.com.
Okay. Kelly, could you type those into the comments for us, please? All right, Diane, would you like to go next?
Yeah, you know, I encourage people, you know, some of my colleagues think we should give up on government schools altogether. And I guess I'm of the philosophy, as long as we have the system we have, it is incumbent on people to make sure there's oversight, there's community oversight of the spending of our money, of the taxation that's imposed upon us to have this system. But you know, I've told people when I was elected to superintendent, I honestly thought God put me in that position to fix education, and I came to realize He put me in that position to open my eyes and realize it can't be fixed. I'm sorry to be unoptimistic about that, but we can watch over the money. We can try to protect our children as best we can, but I honestly think the best thing to do is for parents to be looking at how they can take the responsibility for that education for themselves. And, you know, one of the points Alex made that's just brilliant is as much theoretical oversight as boards have over curriculum, they're buying the textbooks from the same pool. And the pool is filthy. So again, I hate to be discouraging, but parents need to take responsibility for their children, like Tanya said, just like they take responsibility for feeding them and clothing them and bringing them up. But there is still a role to play. And as long as they're taking your money, folks, you need to get there. You need to get to those meetings. You need to listen to the discussions. You need to discernment about the philosophies of the different people who are on your board. And as much as I support parents, yes, criticize, even complain, if you will, but be willing to step up and do something about it too.
Yeah.
If I could follow up on that, I just would encourage parents to let the young people, whether they're their own children or their grandchildren or their neighbor children or whatever, to see you challenging, questioning, speaking out. Because what I see is that students in the schools are being harmed, and they aren't seeing, to a large degree until lately, adults speaking up for them and standing up for them. And so they're left to their own resources, and they need to see us questioning, challenging, speaking, being respectful, and yet determined persevering and speaking for them, protecting them. This is our future. I mean, it's not just because it's our kids, it's because it's the future of our country. And we know what's at stake, and we do have a role to play. And I'm asking those who pull their kids out, which is, I mean, I'm very supportive of that too. Stay engaged. You can't just leave the schools running without, and all the people who see what's going on, oh, they're just doing their own thing over here, and they just walk away. And I don't see that right now. I see people coming in, and I think that's really, really wonderful. But if you feel like you can't accomplish enough, then you're going to just disengage. We can't do that. And I think one of the big obstacles that we face as adults is the fear of being demonized or criticized or name called or made a public fool of or something like that. We have to do it anyway. We cannot say, if people think that you're speaking out too much, so what? Do it anyway. And I think we have to get past that. If we can't do that, how do we expect our children to do it? We have to show them how it's done. And then they can follow in our footsteps and they say, I know how that's done. I know how my parents spoke up, and they challenged and they thought, and they didn't take things just that were told them. They thought it through, they figured it out, and then they spoke out. So that would be my encouragement to everybody. And it's wonderful for us to be connecting with each other. Sign up for our meals. CPLaction.com is our website, and there's just a lot of information on there. And we come and speak on some of these issues if you need someone, but we'll do our best to be a resource and to protect kids.
Good. Alex.
Well, I agree with everything everybody else has said in their concluding remarks. I don't want to discourage people from being actively involved. I love that people are running for school board. I love that people are going to school board meetings and speaking out. But I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that it is a rigged game. They wouldn't let us play it if it wasn't a rigged game. So I see our role more as pointing out that it's a rigged game and doing as much as possible to protect the children rather than trying to fix the game or win the game. I think, and we don't want to let our involvement in school board issues get to the point where it limits our ability to imagine other alternatives. I mean, I think we really need to go back and start asking some really fundamental questions. What is an education? Okay, just because we've had this government school model that's been with us since we were kids and that was with our parents when they were kids, is that an appropriate model? What do we mean by a child getting an education? Do we just mean that they're good at technical stuff and they're going to be able to get a decent job and be productive members of the workforce? Or is there some more transcendent purpose to education? And so I think we need to be asking the bigger questions while at the same time staying actively involved, at the same time doing everything we can to mitigate the damage, doing what we can to make sure the kids are learning how to read properly, not being exposed to graphic and pornographic sexual content and images at young ages. When you think about the damage that's being done to these precious little kids, I've got 5 of them just on the other side of my office door. When you think about the damage that's being done to these millions of precious little kids all across the country, it makes you want to cry. It would be insane for us to just disengage and say, I almost wonder if that's not why they let us homeschool. They think, we'll just let all the nosy parents go do their own thing at home, and then we can do whatever we want with all these kids over here. And we have to say, no way, absolutely not. You're not hurting those kids, not while we can do something about it. So I encourage everybody, please stay involved. Please, if you can run for school board, run for school board. If you can't, support somebody good who's running. Go to these meetings, sound the alarm, get in touch with your local newspaper and tell them that you're upset about this and you want something done. There's so many things we can do, but don't be limited by the system, because the system is a trap. And I'll leave it at that.
Amen.
Kelly, did you want to add something? Closing comments?
There's not a whole lot I can add to that, but I encourage everybody just to speak up, because this is our lives and our children, and we can't be quiet. And when good people stand up, then other people will also find us and will also speak up, and their spines will be stiffened.
Yes, absolutely. And I've been reminded by others of the story of the starfish, where you've walked along the the beach and starfish are littered across the beach from the last storm. And someone picked up one starfish and threw it back in the ocean. And they asked, well, why even bother? There's so many. And the person responded, well, it mattered to that one. And so that's kind of how I feel too. It's like, well, with this little community that I am involved in, I'll make a difference with whatever I can do, with whatever I can exert my ability towards. So all of you who are looking at doing something and getting involved, I encourage you, and you know, seek the Lord, and he will make your path straight. So thank you all for joining us, and check it out online. It will be recorded and posted there so that you can share it with friends. So thank you all.
Thank you. God bless.
Mhm.
Thank you.